Okay, today, since we're learning the Sugya of Talmud Torah, Rosh Hashiva Zatzal once said something that was very sharp. He was not known to mince words and wasn't a conformist. He said once that the way they learn in yeshivas not right now in a certain way is Bittul Torah. Now, why did he say that? Because your father, your grandfather, Rav Shepsler once said, in yeshiva, the goal in yeshiva is to teach you how to learn. Then throughout the rest of your life, to 120, right? You're able to use the tools. Because if you don't know how to learn, then anything you learn is farkak. You don't have the right understanding. And I was just dealing with that. But we have to know that Rav Chaim VeLeMasa brings in the BIUR, it's kedai to look this up, in the Shulchan Aruch. Parenthetically, I'm always fascinated with the Hakdama to every sefer, because it tells you why the author wrote that sefer, and there's a lot of interesting historical stuff. So in the Hakdama to the BIUR HAGRA, which parenthetically Rav Tzvi once told me that he says that it's very important when you learn Shulchan Aruch, you should learn all the BIUR HAGRAs. He says over here that so he talks about, we want to talk about derech halimud today. So I mentioned this to you guys a few weeks ago when you came first, that every single Gadol b'Yisrael except the Ramchal, and including Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and even Rav Aaron Kotler, if you want to come, I have his chuvas, was able to be a poisik also, which means it's a sad thing that people think like there's a MISHNA BERURA Seder and then there's a GEMARAH Seder. Really, it's one thing, and that's why when we give a bracha, we say you should learn Shas and Poiskim, because Poiskim is to bring everything LeHalacha LeMasa. So in the BIUR HAGRA, in his Hakdama to the BIUR HAGRA, Rav Chaim VeLeMasa says something very important. He says, "V'kol shekei shalol la'azniach chas v'shalom eslimut haTalmud HaKadosh and VeLeMasa." So here, there becomes a sticky situation. The Maharsha, if you look over there in the Gemara in Sota, it says that people that paskin from the MISHNA are mavliya olam. So the Hasidim, when they started learning, they very much were emphasizing that you should learn LeHalacha LeMasa, but then there becomes a problem where you just learn Shulchan Aruch and you don't learn the sugyas, the Rashi and the Tosfos and all the... So Rav Chaim VeLeMasa is coming to say that it's interesting, the Gra had many things he could have written his BIUR on, right? But he wrote it on Shulchan Aruch. And there's a reason for that, because the Gra didn't hold from Pilpul. The Gra held that the reason why we learn is not for mental gymnastics. Ultimately, we want to do la'asot retzon borenu, la'asot nachat ruach liyotzenu, la'asot retzon borenu. There's a goal in learning Torah, and the Mishnah says it. Ha'loimed al menas la'asos, ma'aspikim biyadoi, lilmod ulamed, lishmar, la'asos. So, the goal very clearly in learning is that we have to carry out the mitzvahs, right? That's why the Chazal say in the Gemara in Kedushin, Gadol Talmud hamevi lidei ma'aseh. If you do mitzvahs, it's not going to make you necessarily. Let's say you put on tefillin on people every day, right? Like some people do. That's not necessarily going to make you know how to have shalom bayis, right? But if you learn Torah, it's going to help you to do every mitzvah perfectly, right? And the more clearer you learn, right? And so Rav Chaim VeLeMasa here is coming to dispel that theory, which means it's two sides of a coin. Of course, we have to do both. We have to learn BIUR, and that's why I'm so happy my brother-in-law always makes me learn the Pri Megadim, even though it's on Eruvin and it breaks my head up. But you see that it's also a misnomer to think that you can't have deep pilpul within halacha. If you look at the BIUR halacha, the Pri Megadim, and the Chavastas, Anida, and the Ktsois is really a halachic. It's a sefer on Shulchan Aruch, and the Nesivos, right? These were all written on the Shulchan. So Rav Chaim Volozhiner here says that Chas v'Shalom, we should abandon the learning of Shas. So here you have to know historically he didn't like the way the Hasidim are learning, right? The Maharsha writes that people that paskin just from Shulchan Aruch and they didn't know the sugyas, they're destroying the world also. He writes that Reb Tzvi once said, actually, we were at a oneg in his house. He says, you have tens of thousands of shilos and chuvas, right? Shilos and chuvas, Igros Moshe, shilos and chuvas, Minchas Yitzchak, Rav Avadia, Yevi Omer. But why do you need shilos and chuvas? Aren't all the answers in Shulchan Aruch? The answer is no. Because every case, right? Like I just got one of the craziest questions. To paskin, a shaila comes from Shas, not from the Shulchan Aruch. Did you know that? Because Shas is the rationale behind it. Now, obviously, you don't want to paskin against the Rosh and the Rambam and the Rif, right? And the Ramah. So you have to know. But ultimately speaking, there's so many gray areas that the biggest proof, Reb Tzvi said that the halacha will always emanate from Shas. The problem that Rav Avadia writes is that already the Rambam's Rebbe's, the Rimi Gash writes that without the poskim, like somebody like the Rambam, or somebody like the Rif, it's hard for us to know LeHalacha, how to paskin. Like, who are we to come be machriya between Ravina and Ravashi, right? So we need klalim. But ultimately, the neshama of halacha is in Shas. And that's why every day a new Shas Tshuva Sefer comes out, right? Because you have to know the sugya. Once you know the sugya in Shas. So that's what Rav Chaim Volozhiner is saying. He says, Chas v'Shalom, we should, like some other sects were abandoning and they would just learn Shulchan Aruch. He says that's the wrong way. We always have to have a strong, deeply rooted in Shas. But he says, Hamevi lidei Maisa, but we have to learn it by the Hilchasa that brings to Maisa. And look at what Rav Chaim Volozhiner writes. He says, "V'zeh pri kol limud hashas." He says, this is the fruit of all of learning of Shas. Lahotzi mimenu la'alacha l'maisa, right? To bring it out halacha l'maisa. And he says, "Ashrei hashonim halachas amanas lasus l'kayim." And he says that. Can you also bring me a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph, please? He says, lucky to the people that do this. He says that the ultimate goal is that everything we learn is to bring it LeHalacha Maisa, which means, Chas v'Shalom, that's how the Reishis Chachma starts this thing. Rav Chaim Kanyanevsky Shlita, they asked him, what's the two best svarim one should learn in this door? He said, Reishis Chachma and the svarim of the Chavetz Chaim. He has many different, like you were learning, I think the other day, TORAH Sabayis, I saw one. So he says, people that learn Ibai the Hilchasa, Heima HaMekayim is Kolam Kula. These people, they hold up the entire world. So, we'll fast forward to the Kohen HaGadol Me'echav, the Chavetz Chaim. The Chavetz Chaim here goes to explain why he wrote on Orach Chaim. You know that there's 4 chalakim to Shulchan Aruch, and it's really kedai to read the Hakdama to the Mishnah Berurah. I'm going to go through it. I'm going to skip the first paragraph, and he says, and go a little bit towards why he says that. He says, so I'm going to probably the 10th paragraph into the Hakdama. It says, Vehine, af shalimud ha-Torah shekol ma'ashem ve'afil b'kotchem etara sumekayim mitzvahs asat ha-Torah. He says that, of course, even if you learn kotchem etaras like they do in Brisk, right? That's the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. But he says, what should your ikar limud be? So the Chavetz Chaim writes here, Limud hamevi lidei maisa. It should be learning that you could practically know. So Rav Avadia cries out about this. He says, like, you could have a guy learning in Panovich or Lakewood or whatever. He's been in Kollel for 20 years, then he hasn't learned Hilchos Shabbos once per year. That's a shame. Rav Matasyahu, one of the first things when he became mashgiach, actually, in Lakewood, very much he pushed that people should learn, sugyas that are halacha l'maisa, and I think even our own koilel avodas halevi, that was one thing that I think when the Persians came, they were so focused on halacha, it had a ripple effect onto the rest of the olam. But listen to the Chavetz Chaim writes over here. He says, Al Kain Amru Chachamim, right? It's a famous Gemara. Brachos Oyev Hashem Sha'arei Sion, right? Hashem loves Sha'arei Sion Mikol Mishkonot Yaakov. Hashem Oyev Hashem Sha'arim HaMetzuim Ba'alacha Yoser Mikol B'Tei Yaakov. Which base medrash, right? There's many base medrash. Some learn uksin, some learn kodshim, right? Taharas. Some learn nashim, some learn nazikin. But which one is the most precious in the eyes of Hashem, right? It says the one Sharim hamitzuyim ba'alacha yoser mikol b'atei knessia subatei midrashos kolam. The one that's most precious in Hashem's eyes is the one that learns what? Ibay de hilchasa. So he says the Shach brings in Yoredeya that everybody needs to learn halacha every day so he could be mekayim it, lamaisa. And that's why it says, you're muftach lo shoban olam haba. Like, that's the Gemara in the end of Nida. And it says, Vehine. The Chavetz Chaim writes here in his next paragraph, Nira ba'alav dechelek orachaim hu yoser mikudam l'hu. So the Chavetz Chaim is coming to explain here, why did he write MISHNA BERURA on orachaim? Why not on Yoredeya? Why not on Choshen Mishpat, on Even Ezer, right? So he writes that, he says, since this is the most practical, and you can't lift your finger, your hand, right, without knowing orachaim, how to do like bench, how to do natila. And he says it could be, the Chavetz Chaim writes over here, Shmartem es chulkacha asher yasa adam v'chai bahem. Mayom adam t'chila, he says he brings it from the asher yasa. Oh, so that's a very nice thing he learns. He says that's how he learns the MISHNA BERURA, the Chavetz Chaim, the meaning of the pasuk. Ushmartem es chukosai v'es mishpasai asher yasa ha'adam v'chai bahem. So he says, which chukim should you learn? Asher yasa adam, right? He puts the paragraph, the comma there. The things that you learn how to do LeHalacha. Hainu haloimdim hanugim l'maisa b'chol yom. So the Chavetz Chaim is teaching us a very important rule here, and he says, in life, what's more practical should be what we focus more our time on, right? Something that is never really nageya to our life, like obviously, hopefully b'neder tomorrow I could give that shmuz out that we have a chiyuv to learn kol Torah kula, but in life you always have to take precedence, right? There's a lot of options and then you have to see which one takes the precedence. So he's trying to say here something that's nagea, and that here the Chavetz Chaim bemoans. Look what the Chavetz Chaim writes. He says when we look deep into it, with our many sins, he says there's very little people that actually learn Arachaim. These are people that fear Hashem and they're very chazak in Torah and the mitzvahs. And he says, look what the Chavetz Chaim writes. The Chavetz Chaim writes that really such people, before they become experts in all the ksoises or all the nesivas, they should know this. In order they should know how to do it practically. He says, I don't know. He says, I investigated why people don't learn Arachaim Be'iyun. So he says because first of all, this is a very important thing. The Chazon Ish writes that when he was learning he really didn't learn in yeshiva so much, you know that. He got most of his shimas by Rav Chaim Eiser, and he would correspond with Gedolim, but he had his own thing. But he says those few years that he was in yeshiva, the Chazon Ish very much held of learning the Beis Yosef. So he said they would make fun of him. They would say, oh, you're never going to become a lamda, and we're learning Ksois. And he said all those people, the Chazon Ish writes in one of his letters, became nobodies, and I became the Paisek Ador. Right? So he says that a lot of people, the reason why it's a struggle for them, you have to understand, like when you learn Shulchan Aruch, it's very bizarre, some of the simanim, because you have to know it's a sugya and shas. He brings like if you don't know the background of what, right, it's like one of these crazy cases in the Mishnayos and Erevin or whatever, right? So when you go and learn the Rashi and the Tosfos, and you, right, the Chavetz Chaim, if you look at the Hakdama to Shulchan Aruch, he writes Chas v'Shalom. Nobody should learn Shulchan Aruch without learning my Sefer Beis Yosef, because first you have to know all the sugyas where I'm coming from. So the Chavetz Chaim says one of the reasons people have abandoned learning halacha BIUR is because the Shulchan Aruch is like a closed book. It doesn't make sense because you're only looking half of the picture. Maran, Rabbi Yosef Karo himself wanted everybody to first take a look at what? The Bet Yosef. So he says, so he says, Achas ki Shulchan Aruch b'Tolem HaTorah Sefer Chazon ki Beis Yosef. So he says, Chavetz Chaim writes here. He said he never had the intention of a person just opening up Shulchan Aruch. He first wanted you to learn what? The Beis Yosef, because those are the real reasoning, right? It's like you're blindsided. You a lot of these simanim in Shulchan Aruch, it's a sugya in Shas, unless you're familiar with that sugya and know how the Rambam or the Rif or the Rosh are paskening it, you're blindsided. You know, it's hard to get deep into it. But when you learn the Beis Yosef, you understand where he's coming from. But he says even the Beis Yosef, there's a lot of different, he brings down all the different Rishonim. LeHalacha. Lachein Aruch lefaneinu Shulchan HaTorah. So he says, the reason the Shulchan Aruch brought the Shulchan Aruch down is because also, even in the Torah it gets confusing, right? There's so many different. But he says the Shulchan Aruch has that clarity. But again, it's the same problem. It's like trying to learn halacha without learning Gemara. So the Shulchan Aruch did us a favor. He brings down, the Gemaras in a more concise way. But in the end of the day, you need both. So he says a lot of times in the Shulchan Aruch also there's a yesh v'yesh, right? There's yesh ayimrim like this, yesh ayimrim like that. Some things the chatchila, some things the rabbanan. He says even the Shulchan Aruch, obviously there's hundreds of pirushim, right? The Magen Avram, the Taz, right? The MISHNA BERURA, the BIUR HAGRA. The Shulchan Aruch itself is a sefer from 500 years ago that itself needs a clarification, because who exactly do you paskin like when he brings three different shittas even in the Shulchan Aruch, right? Yesh v'yesh v'yesh. When he brings stam of v'yesh. Asher lo yispar l'adam kim al yidei ta'amim v'lemot kol din v'dim Shulchan Aruch v'mukor v'tamim yichbad zeh. So even the Chavetz Chaim writes, he says for regular balabatim, see, that's the luxury you have of being a Ben Torah, but he says for regular balabatim, it's too hard for them to go learn the entire Beis Yosef, because to understand the Beis Yosef, you have to learn the Gemara, right? Like we said, everything starts from the Gemara, the Rishonim. Beis Yosef did a concise. You guys got to the Beis Yosef, no? So in the Beis Yosef, so he says people don't have time to do. Really, the right way to learn as any sugya and shas is that you, the same way that you learn in a yeshiva, you learn with all the pilpul, but then you see, that's the tragedy of it, in my opinion, that you see the whole thing, but then you don't see the halacha l'maisa, because in the end of the day, the entire goal of the Torah is nasiv and nishma, right? We have to carry out the Torah. That takes precedence even before learning. The nishma is the second thing, but the goal, obviously. So he says over here, he says that it becomes very, very, very. So he says that's one reason. One reason that people don't learn Shulchan Aruch, the Chavetz Chaim writes, is you have to learn all the Beis Yosefs. To understand all the Beis Yosefs, you have to learn all the Gemaras, right? And it's too cumbersome on the regular balabas. You have to understand. Until a few years ago, people had to work 10, 12 hours a day to be able to put food on the table. It was very, very difficult, and they would eat. So he says the second reason is he says there's so many different machlokessim, right? There's the Chaya Adam Shita, this Shita, right, that Shita. And you become confused when you learn the Shulchan Aruch. Because then you learn the Shach, right? Or you learn the Magen Avram, you learn the Taz, and then you see all the other Achronim there. Who do we paskin like? Right? So that's why the Chavetz Chaim came to clarify that he says, listen, if there's a Machlokes, Magen Avram, this or that, all these different things. So he says, the bottom line that we see from here in the Hakdama of the Mishnah Berurah is that really it's what Rav Shach Zatzal also said. He said that, through the course of one's life, every Jew's goal should to be finish all of Shulchan Aruch and Shas. But what I'm trying to bring out is that really Shulchan Aruch and Shas is not two different worlds, right? The right way to learn, and this is how every single Gadol BeYisrael used to learn till people started going off the derech because of the Askala, and Rab Chaim Brisk made it that there should be a tremendous focus on pilpul and mental enlightenment. But like I said, like even Rosh Hashiva Zatzal Rav Ruderman, he had smicha, and he was mishamish the kovne rav, and we see this throughout all the Gedolim, whether Sephardi or Ashkenazi. And the bottom line I wanted to just bring out to you about learning Ibadah Hilchasa is a fascinating thing Rab the Chevron Rosh Hashiva brings. He brings a Sifri. He says that it's actually we're getting to Devarim. It says in the pasuk over there, I think it's in Parashas Re'eh or Ekev, it says Ushmartem oisam la'asois oisam, something like that. There's a pasuk. So the Sifri says that Ushmartem, what's the difference between Asis and Ushmartem? So if you look in the Mefarshim, it says that the Chevron Rosh Hashiva has a beautiful essay on this. I don't have the Sefer in front of me actually right now. It was the Sefer Hadron Allah, but I remember it. I remember it because I've taught it that many times. He basically explains the Sifri, the Chevron Rosh Hashiva, Rav Chatzkel. He says that ultimately the whole mahus, the whole way one should learn is, you have to get such a clarity in learning. Do you guys learn that Gemara in Kedushin? Vishinantam sheyeh divrei Torah mechudadim beficha, right? Shem yishalcha adam al tiskam gin v'amar lo miyad, right? The Torah amar lebina achoisias, right? You should have such a clarity to the Torah that you should know her like your sister. So it says over there, the Rav Chatzkel says a beautiful thing. He says ultimately the way one has to learn is, first of all, step number one is understand it with the utmost clarity. Ushmartem means to review it so much. And then the last and final goal of the learning is la'asoisam, right? That through your clarity and chazara, now when a halacha lamaisa comes, right, you have to be able to paskin for yourself. And that's what the Rosh Hashiva Shlita said, that the Chazon Ish and the Stipler told him that the Chazon Ish held that any Talmid Chacham that knows how to learn and puts enough time on a sugya, he's not necessarily, I mean, sometimes it would be silly to go against Rav Moshe, but he says he has the koyach to, carry out the halachos that come out from that sugya based on his best understanding. He's not necessarily incumbent to have to listen to one of the poskim of that generation, right? Because he himself went through the sugya, and this is how he understood, right? I mean, it'd be silly to go against the Gadol Hador unless you have very strong rayas. But the bottom line is that what we're trying to bring out today is that there's only really one way of learning, and that's what Rav Chaim Volozhiner said. That we have to learn with the utmost depth and biyun and clarity, but like Rav Chaim Volozhiner said, Zep Pri Kol Amal Ashas. What's the whole fruit of our labors of learning is lahavia oso LeHalacha LeMasa, is to bring it. And I tell you something, you get so much more hana when you learn LeHalacha LeMasa. You know why? Because then your learning is more practical. You know, when a shaila in Hilchas Shabbos or Hilchas Brachos, or right, it comes up, and you know, ultimately, that's the only way to learn. That's the correct way to learn, and that's the way we should all be learning. Amen.